June 17, 1943, 1:42 a.m., as a cold crescent moon hung over the endless wheat fields of southern Russia, its pale light trembling across the mist-soaked grasslands, a tiny wooden biplane drifted low over the treetops, its engine whispering in the darkness before fading into complete silence. In that moment, the night sky seemed to stop breathing. The only sound was the soft creak of wings, fabric stretched over thin frames, carrying two Soviet women into the heart of a battlefield that belonged to shadows and fire. The Germans on the ground below scanned the sky, pointing searchlights that sliced through the darkness like white blades. They expected the roar of engines, the heavy drone of bombers, the familiar rhythm of mechanized war. But tonight, the air felt wrong, too still, too quiet, too expectant. A lieutenant near the front line paused mid-sentence, his cigarette glowing faintly, as he sensed something approaching, though he could not hear it. His men looked up. Nothing moved. Then, faintly at first, came the sound that every German soldier on the Eastern Front would learn to fear. Not an engine, not machinery, but a low, eerie rustle. It was the sound of fabric wings gliding on cold night air, a sound so unnatural, so ghost-like, that the Germans gave its owners a name whispered around trenches: Nachthexen, night witches. High above, Lieutenant Yevdokia, Dunya, Bashanskia kept her gloved hands steady on the controls of a P-2 biplane, its open cockpit freezing her fingers despite the thick wool lining. The aircraft, little more than wood, canvas, and determination, shivered as it plunged through a pocket of cold wind. She and her navigator, Sergeant Polina Osipenko, huddled in their bulky flight suits as the world below stretched like a vast black ocean, dotted with German camps, artillery batteries, fuel depots, and the faint glow of burning ruins. Their orders tonight were clear: disrupt German supply lines near Taganrog, where ammunition depots, fuel trucks, and reserve units were gathering for a push toward the southern Soviet defenses. But their mission was more than military. It was psychological. Panic was a weapon. Fear was fuel. And the night witches wielded both with precision. Dunya checked her watch. 1:43 a.m. time to vanish. She reached forward, tapped Paulina's shoulder, and cut the engine. Instant silence. The spinning propeller slowed until it stopped entirely, leaving only the cold whistle of wind. Their biplane became a drifting shadow, nearly invisible, gliding straight toward the German encampment whose guards remained completely unaware of the danger approaching overhead. Below, the German lieutenant froze again. That sound, like a broom sweeping across the air, scratched at his nerves. But by the time searchlights reacted, it was already too late. Dunya released their small cluster of bombs, primitive, hand-dropped, but deadly when placed with precision. They tumbled silently toward the earth, and for 3 seconds the world held its breath. Then the night erupted. A chain of explosions tore through the depot, scattering trucks, blasting ammunition crates, and lighting the sky with a fiery bloom that spread across German supply lines. The shock wave rattled helmets and sent German soldiers diving for cover. Machine guns barked blindly into the dark, tracer fire slicing through empty air as the night witches glided upward, unnoticed, unreachable. Only after the bombs fell did Dunya restart the engine. The biplane sputtered, coughed, then roared to life, a voice rising only after the damage was done. Paulina exhaled shakily. "That's one," she said, reaching for the next set of bombs. "One of many," Dunya murmured, and she banked the aircraft sharply to the east, preparing for another run. "Before we continue, please let me know, did anyone in your family fight in or live through World War II? Share their stories in the comments. Let's continue the story." But their night had begun long before this raid. Hours earlier, at a crude airstrip carved from open farmland, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment prepared their aircraft under dim lanterns. Mechanics, mostly teenage girls, worked quickly in silence, patching bullet holes with canvas strips, hammering loose struts back into place, filling fuel tanks with hand pumps. The Pa-2s were ancient training planes by aviation standards, designed before the war, slower than trucks, vulnerable to wind, unable to carry heavy loads. Their open cockpits exposed pilots to freezing temperatures. Their maximum speed barely exceeded a German fighter's stall speed. Yet these fragile wooden cloth machines had advantages no modern fighter could match. They were silent when gliding. They could fly low, almost brushing treetops. They were too slow for German radar to reliably track. And at night, even searchlights struggled to lock onto them before they vanished into the darkness. The women of the 588th knew all of this. They also knew their survival depended on precision, teamwork, and nerves of steel. Commander Marina Raskova, the famed Soviet aviator who founded the regiment, had drilled an iron mindset into her pilots. You may have the weakest planes in the war, but you will fly with the strongest hearts. On this night, Dunya and Polina had already flown 5 missions before the Taganrog strike. Each time they returned, their plane trembled from strain, bullet holes stitched across its wings, fabric torn by shrapnel, oil streaking the fuselage like black tears. Mechanics patched and refueled their Pa-2 in a frantic 5-minute scramble, pushing it back into the air before engine heat could fade. There was no rest. There was no pause. Every mission meant a new risk. Every pass brought them closer to German anti-aircraft guns, whose crews had learned to fire wildly at the faint silhouettes overhead. But tonight's final target was crucial. German reinforcements were gathering, and if they reached the front intact, the Soviet defensive line could buckle. The Night Witches would make sure that didn't happen. As Dunya guided the aircraft into a wide loop, Polina peered through the darkness using a small, dim flashlight covered by red cloth. She checked maps scrawled with enemy positions. She had learned to read the battlefield by touch, by instinct, by understanding the faint glow of fires and searchlights below. "Flak battery near the rail tracks," she warned. "New position. They're expecting us." Dunya nodded. "Then we won't give them what they expect." She angled the plane lower, almost hugging the treetops. Branches scraped the underside as they descended into the darkness. It was insane, reckless even, but being predictable was death. The Germans had begun tracking their patterns, predicting their routes. So the Night Witches adapted, always changing altitude, always changing timing, always improvising. Another gust of wind slammed the biplane sideways. The frame shook violently. In any other aircraft, this would be a death sentence. But the Pa-2's flexible wooden wings absorbed the impact, bending instead of breaking. Ahead, the German searchlights swept the sky, unaware of the shadow creeping toward them. Polina felt the cold wind sting her eyes. "Ready," she whispered. Dunya cut the engine again. The world fell silent. Below, German sentries saw movement. Too late. The tiny plane glided over their battery, unseen until it drifted through a cone of light. Shouts rang out. Machine guns roared. Tracers lit the sky with orange threads. But the Night Witches had already released their next bombs. The explosions shattered the anti-aircraft guns, sending splinters of metal and wood flying through the camp. Fire spread rapidly. Searchlights flickered and died. As Dunya restarted the engine and pulled the biplane into a steep climb, bullets snapped past them like angry hornets. One punched through the upper wing, ripping canvas. Another carved a groove along the landing gear strut. Polina clutched the side of the cockpit. That was close. Dunya exhaled slowly. Closer than I'd like. But they were alive. Back at the airstrip, when they finally landed, mechanics rushed forward in disbelief. The Pa-2 looked like a survivor pulled from a storm. One wheel damaged, wing fabric torn in ribbons, the propeller barely holding its shape. Yet Dunya stepped down with a tired smile. Polina followed, rubbing warmth back into her numb hands. "They hit us 5 times, Polina said. 6, Dunya corrected. "The last one was under the tail." Marina Raskova approached, her uniform dusty, her eyes bright with equal parts pride and worry. "Did you strike the depot?" "We burned it," Dunya replied. "Burned everything." Marina nodded. "Good. The front line will feel that." Around them, the airstrip buzzed with exhaustion and adrenaline. Dozens of women, pilots, navigators, mechanics, worked through the night, preparing for the next sorties. Some laughed, some cried quietly, some slept against the wings of their planes for mere minutes. They were young. Many were barely 20. Some were still teenagers. But they fought like veterans, fearless in the face of impossible odds. They had no armor, no heavy weapons, no radios, no advanced instruments, only courage, skill, and a plane the world underestimated. Yet Germany, one of the most powerful armies on earth, feared them, feared the silence, feared the darkness, feared the night skies alive with unseen wings, feared the night witches. June 17, 1943, 3:09 a.m., as the last traces of fire faded from the German depot near Taganrog, the night sky returned to its heavy silence, but behind that quiet lay a deeper tension, for the night witches were not finished, and the Germans knew it. At an encampment 10 kilometers from the burning ruins, German soldiers stood sleepless, clutching rifles with trembling fingers, their nerves frayed by the constant whisper of wings overhead. Every snap of a branch, every gust of wind, every flicker of movement in the sky felt like the warning breath of another Soviet attack. Officers barked orders, repositioning machine guns and anti-aircraft cannons, trying to predict where the next strike would fall. But prediction was useless. These women did not fly by rules. They flew by instinct, by improvisation, by a kind of courage that even hardened German veterans could not understand. Meanwhile, at the Soviet airstrip carved crudely into the farmland, the 588th Night Bomber Regiment worked with relentless urgency. The air was freezing, thick with the smell of gasoline and wet earth, and lanterns cast trembling halos of light as mechanics swarmed the damaged platoons. Hammering, stitching, bandaging planes like wounded soldiers, they worked in silence except for the occasional hiss of a fuel line or the soft grunt of a mechanic tightening a bolt with numb hands. Their fingers were raw, their eyes stung from exhaustion, but they knew the women they served depended on them. Without rapid repairs, no one flew, and without flight, the German advance would push onward unchecked. Dunya and Polina stood beside their battered plane as a mechanic named Kotia knelt beneath the landing gear, shaking her head. "Another centimeter deeper," she whispered, touching a bullet groove carved into the wooden strut, "and you too would be gone." Polina managed a tired smile. "Then be grateful the Germans have bad aim at night." But Kotia did not laugh. Her sister had been killed months earlier serving in a ground unit. She had no humor left when danger brushed this close to the people she now considered family. Dunya reached out and touched her shoulder gently. "We trust your hands more than any armor," she said, and for a moment, the weight of war softened just slightly. Across the airfield, Marina Raskova paced with her arms folded tightly, her boots sinking slightly into the damp soil with every step. Reports from the front confirmed what she already suspected. The Germans were preparing for a renewed push at dawn, and the night witches needed to cripple as many supply lines as possible before first light. Every plane counted. Every mission mattered. Every pilot who could still stand would fly. As Dunya and Polina climbed back into their platoon, fatigue settled into their bones like ice. Their bodies begged for rest, but rest was a luxury no one in the regiment could afford. The engine sputtered weakly at first, almost refusing to cooperate, before roaring unevenly to life. Mechanics stepped back, covering their ears as the wooden propeller tore through the air. Dunya tightened her scarf against the biting wind and rolled the plane forward, engines rattling, wings trembling. She knew very well that one more bullet in the wrong place would shatter her plane like a matchstick, but she also knew why she flew. Every night raid delayed the German advance, bought time for Soviet reinforcements, weakened enemy supply chains, and saved lives. Their missions were small in scale, but enormous in effect. As the Po-2 lifted off the runway, rising slowly into the thick darkness, Polina leaned forward, gripping her mapboard. "Next target, German artillery positions near the riverbed," she said, her voice hoarse. "Heavily guarded." Dunya nodded. "Good. If it's important, it's worth the risk." They pushed eastward, the cold wind slapping their faces as the night swallowed them whole. 4 minutes at a time, neither spoke. They flew low, skimming the treetops to avoid radar, their eyes scanning the faint glow of burning supply trucks on the horizon. Far below, wolves howled, a haunting sound that floated up through the darkness like a reminder of the untamed world beneath the war. As they neared the artillery positions, German spotlights danced in the distance, sweeping the sky with practiced precision. Machine guns clattered sporadically, their tracers streaking upward at imaginary shadows. The Germans were jumpy. Good. Fear was a weapon, and the night witches wielded it ruthlessly. "Wind coming from the north," Polina whispered, adjusting her compass. "We'll drift if we cut the engine too early." Dunya inhaled, steadying her breath. "Then we'll get closer than usual." Polina shot her a sharp look. "Closer? They nearly hit us last time." Dunya smiled faintly. "Which means they'll be aiming too high." She cut the engine, and silence swallowed them once more. The Po-2 glided like a ghost, slipping between columns of searchlights, its wooden wings whispering against the wind. The German soldiers below stiffened, sensing something they could not see. A spotlight swung left, right, then froze, just a hair too slow. Dunya released their bombs. They fell, invisible drops of destruction plummeting toward the earth. 3 seconds of pure stillness. Then the ground erupted. Flames tore through the artillery positions, swallowing guns, munitions crates, and tents. The blast illuminated the biplane's underside just long enough for a few German gunners to spot it. Machine guns roared to life. Tracers laced the sky, ripping past the fragile plane. One grazed the wingtip, sending splinters flying. Another punched through the canvas near Polina's foot. She jerked upward instinctively, heart hammering. "We're hit," she shouted. "We're flying," Dunya corrected sharply. With a sudden burst of power, she restarted the engine and banked hard left, diving low over the treetops as bullets shredded the air behind them. They didn't stop climbing until the gunfire faded into the distance. Polina exhaled shakily, rubbing her temples. "One day, Dunya. One day that engine won't restart." Dunya kept her eyes forward, her voice low, almost solemn. "Then we'll glide into legend." For a moment, Polina said nothing. Then she laughed, a tired, breathless, frightened laugh that broke the tension like a crack in the night. And together they flew back toward the airfield, unsure if they'd survive another mission, but certain they'd try. Because that was the unspoken oath of the night witches. If the motherland needed them, they would fly until their wings failed. August 23, 1942, 1:12 a.m., beneath a moonless Stalingrad sky. The air pressed thick and cold against the wings of the Po-2 as Yevdokia, Dina, Nikulina steadied her breathing, feeling the trembling wooden frame beneath her gloves as though the aircraft itself were alive, a fragile creature held aloft by more than engineering, for the Po-2 was never meant to fly into war, yet here it was. And here she was, guiding it like a phantom across a battlefield where firestorms swallowed entire. Districts and German flak carved burning scars across the darkness. Below her, Stalingrad was a furnace, blocks of ruins glowing like embers in a dying hearth, tanks scattered like broken toys, gun batteries flashing in brutal rhythms as the city fought for each brick, each basement, each surviving heartbeat. The Night Witches had been ordered to attack a German supply checkpoint on the city's western edge, a staging area where trucks lined up for fuel, ammunition, and rations before pushing toward the shattered industrial district, and Dina knew that striking it wouldn't just slow the German advance. It would give Soviet defenders a few precious hours to breathe. Her navigator, Irina Molisheva, pressed a finger along the map strapped to her thigh, her eyes reflecting the glow from the burning city below as she whispered wind adjustments over the roar of the slipstream, though there was barely any roar at all. The P2 hummed lightly, like a sewing machine held together with stubbornness, courage, and thin wooden ribs. The Germans had grown used to Stuka sirens, Heinkel bombers, Messerschmitt escorts, loud, heavy, terrifying machines that shook the earth, but the Night Witches were different. They crept upon the enemy like folklore spirits, witches of the wind, invisible until their bombs erupted, and this mission would be no different. Though tonight the flak batteries were heavier than usual, and Dina could already see the intermittent bursts of tracer fire sweeping the open sky, clawing upward toward her. Position with murderous intent. She cut the engine, and the world fell utterly silent. Only the wind whispered against the canvas wings as the aircraft drifted, sinking slowly toward the German checkpoint like a falling leaf. The sudden silence always brought a spike of fear. Every Night Witch felt it, but it also brought power, because silence made them invisible. Irina leaned forward, eyes sharp, scanning for the faint silhouette of the supply depot. Below, rows of trucks glinted under dim lamps, their shadows stretching across the dirt as German soldiers moved between fuel barrels and stacked crates. Dina lifted her hand, counted the seconds as they descended, and pulled the release. 2 small bombs tumbled downward, slicing into the darkness, falling silently until they struck the earth with a shattering roar that ripped through vehicles, bodies, and fuel lines in a chain of explosions that lit the ground like a sunrise torn open too early. Flames erupted into the sky, illuminating Dina's aircraft for the first time, and with it, every German gunner saw them. Tracers shot upward like angry comets, shredding the air, forcing Dina to wrench the P2 into a sharp climb as the little aircraft groaned from the sudden strain. She reignited the engine, its sputtering cough sounding impossibly gentle amid the thunder below, and the P2 clawed upward, barely faster than a speeding truck, weaving through fire and shrapnel as German gunners cursed the ghost-like enemies they could hear only when it was too late. But the mission wasn't finished. Night Witch doctrine required multiple passes, not one. They flew in pairs or trios. While one aircraft attacked, another drew fire, and a third swooped in unnoticed. Tonight, Dina and Irina formed the second wave. Ahead of them, 2 other P2s were already lining up their own silent glides, their dark shapes nearly impossible to spot against the black sky. As Dina circled for her second pass, she saw one of the bombers hit, an eruption of sparks as a tracer round caught the wing, sending one of her comrades spiraling downward, trailing smoke. The pilot fought to regain control, but the tiny wooden frame couldn't endure the damage. The aircraft plunged behind a burning warehouse, and a second explosion shook the ground. Irina gasped, covering her mouth, eyes wide with horror, but Dina's voice cut through her shock, steady, grounded, shaped by countless nights of forcing fear into silence. "We finished the mission," she said. "For them." The Germans intensified their fire, their panic growing as more fuel trucks ignited and metal debris flew into the night. Dina climbed, cut the engine again, and glided through the darkness, this time lower, riskier, almost skimming the rooftops. She could see German soldiers scrambling, shouting orders, rolling out water barrels, dragging hoses, firing rifles upward in a desperate attempt to ward off the invisible attackers. Irina sighted the remaining bombs, her voice barely audible as she whispered, "Now!" The second pair of bombs fell. A massive ammunition crate exploded, sending a fireball spiraling into the air with a deafening crack that drowned out even the flak guns. The checkpoint collapsed into chaos. Vehicles overturned, supply lines severed, soldiers scattered, and the German advance into the industrial district stalled for hours, long enough for Soviet defenders to reinforce positions that had been on the verge of collapse. Dina restarted the engine once more, the Pa-2 coughing apologetically as it pushed upward into the night sky. The mission was complete, but the escape was still ahead, and German fighters had begun circling the area, desperate to catch the witches who had tormented them for months. A Messerschmitt appeared suddenly from the north, its spotlight sweeping the sky like a blade. Dina dove hard left, the fragile aircraft rattling violently as the Messerschmitt overshot, too fast to maintain visual lock. That was the Night Witch's advantage. The enemy fighters were simply too powerful, too fast, too heavy to effectively target something as slow and agile as the Pa-2. The German pilot looped back, furious, firing bursts of cannon fire that lit the darkness, but Dina hugged the treetops, vanishing into the forest shadow as Irina clung to the fuselage, praying under her breath. Moments later, the Messerschmitt roared overhead again, frustrated, unable to descend further without risking a crash. It peeled away, and silence returned. Only when the German fighter vanished into the distance did Dina breathe again. The sky now felt gentler, the wind softer, and the path home clear. Two limped back toward the Soviet airstrip, a muddy field marked with faint lanterns, but their victory carried weight and sorrow. When they landed, news of the downed Night Witch crew was already spreading. Women gathered silently around the small fire pit beside the barracks, some crying, some staring into the flames, some sharpening tools or repairing uniforms because work numbed grief. Dina and Irina stepped out of the aircraft exhausted, their bodies trembling from adrenaline and fatigue. Their commander approached quietly, nodding once as she said, "You struck the checkpoint. The Germans won't move on the factory tonight. You bought the city time." Dina didn't smile. She simply asked, "Who didn't return?" One name was spoken, then another, then silence. Yet the mission would continue, because it had to. September 2nd, 1942, 2:41 a.m., under a sky choked with smoke drifting from the burning ruins of Stalingrad, Yevdokia, Dina Nikulina stood beside her Pa-2 with her gloves pressed against the frost-slick wooden fuselage, feeling the dampness of night settle into her sleeves while the distant thunder of artillery rolled like an approaching storm beyond the Volga. The smell of burning factories and scorched wheat drifted on the wind, mixing with the oil-soaked scent of Soviet aircraft lined up like skeletal silhouettes against the faint glow of lanterns. Tonight's mission was riskier than any before. The Night Witches were ordered to fly deep past the Stalingrad front, beyond the German Sixth Army's fortified perimeter, and strike an ammunition depot near the Gumrak Airfield, one of the main arteries keeping German forces supplied during their push into the heart of the city. If they succeeded, the German advance would stall. If they failed, the 62nd Army fighting inside the collapsing buildings of the Red October factory district might not last another week. Dina checked her map one more time as Irina Molisheva tightened the strap on her headset, her hands trembling not from fear but from exhaustion. They had flown 6 missions in the last 48 hours, most lasting less than 10 minutes from takeoff to bomb release, but every moment filled with the terror of searchlights, flak bursts, and unseen fighters sweeping down from the dark sky like predators hunting prey. The Pa-2 engine sputtered to life with its familiar sewing machine rhythm, soft and almost comforting, and Dina climbed into the cockpit as Irina settled into the navigator's seat, both women exchanging a single look, the look of soldiers too tired to speak yet too determined to yield. "Engines running," Irina whispered. "Wind from the north. Path is clear." Dina nodded, pushed the throttle gently forward, and the Pa-2 rolled across the dirt strip, bouncing over frozen ruts until the wings lifted them into the starless sky. As they climbed above the Volga's icy expanse, the city unfolded beneath them like a burning scar across the earth. Hand-to-hand combat flickered between shattered buildings like sparks from dying embers, machine-gun fire stitched through the darkness, and German flares burst above the ruins in harsh white light that briefly illuminated everything, the bodies, the rubble, the chaos. Dina steadied her breath, keeping low to avoid detection. The Germans had grown increasingly aggressive, positioning searchlights in overlapping grids and mounting rapid-fire guns along likely night which approach corridors. They had also adjusted tactics, listening not for engines but for the silence that preceded the glide, a silence more terrifying to them than the bombs themselves. The night witches adapted in return, varying their approach paths, flying lower, slower, and performing decoy dives to draw fire away from teammates. Tonight, the route to Gumrak required crossing through one of the densest anti-aircraft sectors in the region, and Dina adjusted her course to weave between known artillery nests while Irina read coordinates by the faint glow of a filtered lamp. 25 minutes to target, Irina said. 2 flak positions ahead. We need to fly between them. Dina angled the plane downward, brushing the tops of ruined chimneys as she navigated through the devastated residential blocks where families once slept peacefully before the war turned their homes to dust. 10 minutes later, the first searchlights snapped on. Brilliant cones of white sliced through the darkness, sweeping the sky in frantic arcs as German operators scanned for intruders. Dina cut the engine instantly, letting the Per-2 drift as quietly as an owl gliding over treetops. But one searchlight caught a glimpse, a flicker, just enough for its operator to shout a warning. Within seconds, 3 beams converged, trapping the Per-2 in a cage of light. "Hold tight," Dina shouted as she yanked the stick-hard left, the plane groaning from the sudden maneuver. Flak erupted around them in violent bursts, each explosion rattling the fragile wings as fragments hissed past them like molten bees. Irina clung to the fuselage, trying to read their altitude through the violent shaking. "We can't take another hit like that," Irina said through clenched teeth. Dina didn't respond. She banked sharply into a dive so steep Irina's stomach lurched, but the maneuver worked. The searchlights lost them for a moment, and Dina reignited the engine, speeding low across the fields before the beams could recover. More bursts followed behind them, but each one landed farther away. When the sky finally darkened again, they both exhaled. 12 minutes to target, Irina said, voice steadier now. The depot is heavily guarded. Expect more searchlights. Dina gave a thin smile that vanished as she saw something ahead. German trucks rolling toward the depot, headlights dimmed. Reinforcements. Supplies. More ammunition for the assault on Stalingrad. The night witches weren't meant to attack moving convoys, but tonight there was no choice. Dina angled the plane lower, descending to an altitude so close to the ground Irina could see individual soldiers marching beside the vehicles. Dina cut the engine again. Silence engulfed them. A moment later, she released a small bomb intended for soft targets. It fell directly into the center of the convoy. The explosion tore through the trucks, igniting fuel barrels, scattering soldiers, and blocking the narrow road with burning wreckage. The German troops scrambled, firing rifles blindly into the darkness as the Per-2's silhouette disappeared into the smoke. "They'll expect us now," Irina warned. "Then we give them something they won't expect," Dina replied, pushing the throttle to full as the Per-2 climbed sharply. They reached the Gumrak depot minutes later. The ground below was a hive of activity, rows upon rows of ammunition crates, fuel drums, vehicle parks, and tents where German officers coordinated resupply operations. Searchlights roamed aggressively, aware of the earlier attack. Dina circled high above, assessing their chances. The depot's defenses were far stronger than anticipated. At least 4 flak batteries, 3 machine gun nests, and a network of searchlights covering every angle. Their chances of a clean glide were slim, but not impossible. "We need to break their pattern," Dina said. "We'll use the old trick. Double glide." Irina's eyes widened. A double glide was extremely dangerous. They would cut the engine twice in one attack run, each time risking a stall. But Dina had made up her mind. The lives of thousands fighting inside Stalingrad depended on this. She approached from the east. At 600 meters, she cut the engine. The plane drifted in silence. Searchlights swept overhead, unaware. At 400 meters, Dina restarted the engine briefly, just long enough to adjust her trajectory, and the sudden noise startled the German gunners, causing several to fire prematurely. Dina cut the engine again. The Per-2 became a ghost, gliding directly over the depot. "Now!" Irina shouted. Dina released both bombs. The first bomb struck an ammunition crate. The second hit a fuel stockpile. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the world exploded. A fireball ripped through the depot, followed by a chain of secondary detonations that engulfed the entire area. Trucks were hurled into the air like toys. Crates burst into flaming shrapnel. German soldiers ran in every direction, their shouts drowned beneath the crackling inferno. The shockwave hit the Per-2 like a giant's fist, sending it spinning sideways as Dina fought to regain control. For a moment, the plane seemed ready to fall apart. But she steadied it, leveled it, and reignited the engine. Anti-aircraft guns were silent now, the operators either dead, stunned, or unable to see through the smoke. Dina and Irina climbed into the night sky, shaken, breathless, victorious. Behind them, the Gumrak depot, one of the lifelines of the German Sixth Army, was gone. The flight home was quiet. Too quiet. But for once, the silence felt like relief instead of danger. When they landed, mechanics and fellow pilots rushed to meet them, lifting Irina from the cockpit as she nearly collapsed. Their commander approached, her face pale with exhaustion yet glowing with fierce pride. "You did it," she said softly. "You struck a blow that the whole front will feel." Dina looked past her toward the dark horizon where the enemy still fought, still advanced, still threatened to crush Stalingrad. "One blow," she murmured. "Many more to go." But tonight, the night witches had changed the course of a battle. And Germany knew it. October 18th, 1942, 1:07 a.m., under a bruised violet sky swirling with drifting fog that clung to the treetops like ghostly hands, Yevdokia, Dina, Nikulina tightened her scarf as a bitter wind sliced across the forward airstrip near Beketovka, where the 588th Night Bomber Regiment had temporarily relocated to support the Soviet counteroffensive building around Stalingrad. The air was thick with the metallic tang of artillery smoke and the earthy musk of damp soil, and each breath tasted like ash from the city's endless fires to the north, reminding every pilot that the fate of the entire southern front hinged on what happened in the coming weeks. Dina stood beside her battered Per-2 as mechanics worked by lantern light, patching bullet holes with pieces of canvas and tightening wires that hummed in the wind like violin strings. Tonight's objective was one of the most dangerous yet, a series of fortified German artillery positions west of the Don River that had been hammering Soviet trenches relentlessly for days, halting every attempt at breakthrough and inflicting devastating casualties. Soviet commanders estimated that unless those guns were silenced quickly, the counterattack planned for the end of the month might collapse before it began. And so, once again, the task fell to the witches of the night, the women the Germans feared more than darkness itself. Dina checked her bombs, small, crude, deadly, secured beneath the wings, while Irina Molisheva unfolded a new map, her fingers trembling from exhaustion masked beneath determination. They had both flown more missions in the past 2 weeks than most male bomber crews flew in a month. Fatigue wasn't a burden anymore. It was a constant companion. They took off at 1:24 a.m., the Per-2 lifting into a sky muffled by thick fog that hid their silhouette but also threatened navigation. Beneath them, the faint outline of the Volga shimmered like a fractured silver ribbon reflecting distant flames. Every sound was amplified in the still night, the soft churn of the engine, the whisper of wind over the wooden frame, the muted rumble of combat miles away. Irina leaned forward, shouting over the wind, "Visibility poor. We stay low. Follow the ridge line until the river bend." Dina nodded, guiding the fragile aircraft just meters above the treetops, trusting Irina's instincts more than her instruments in this blind world of drifting vapor and moonless dark. As they crossed into enemy airspace, the faint glow of German campfires appeared through the fog like dying stars scattered across the earth. Dina banked slightly, adjusting their approach. The Germans had tightened defenses after the Gumrak explosion and had begun spacing out their searchlights, creating deadly choke points that funneled enemy planes into predictable routes. But the Night Witches were unpredictable. Their greatest weapon wasn't machinery, but imagination. Irina suddenly raised a hand, pointing ahead where thin beams of white stabbed through the fog, German searchlights sweeping rhythmically, slow and precise. Dina cut the engine, letting the Per-2 glide silently toward the first defensive barrier. The fog became their ally now, swallowing the plane in its swirling embrace. The searchlights passed dangerously close, illuminating the edges of the fog like glowing claws grasping for prey. With each silent drift, Dina's grip tightened on the controls. The Per-2 felt weightless, almost unreal, as though it hovered on breath alone. Only when they slipped fully past the first barrier did Dina restart the engine with a soft sputter, angling the plane toward the artillery positions that lay just beyond a cluster of devastated farmhouses. Then the fog thinned, and danger appeared instantly. 3 searchlights erupted from the ground, slicing upward in coordinated arcs that converged on the sky around them. Dina dove sharply, her heart hammering as she tried to escape the beams, but the Germans had anticipated the low approach. A burst of flak exploded dangerously close, showering the aircraft with fragments that tore through the wing fabric. Irina ducked instinctively, shouting, "We have to lose them!" Dina banked hard right, pushing the Per-2 into a tight spiral that the slow-turning searchlights struggled to track. But then a new threat emerged, the distant snarl of a Bf-110 night fighter prowling the sky. Its twin engines echoed through the fog like the growl of a hunting wolf. "They sent fighters tonight," Irina whispered, her voice trembling. The Germans had finally adapted. Dina pushed the throttle to the limit, but the Per-2 wasn't built for speed. It was a leaf in a storm compared to the Bf-110's hunting power. The only advantage they had was maneuverability and silence. As the fighter closed in, Dina made a split-second decision. She cut the engine again. The Per-2 fell into a silent drop. The fog swallowed them completely. The night fighter streaked past above them, overshooting, confused by the sudden disappearance of its prey. Irina let out a shaky breath, clutching the map to her chest. "We only get lucky like that once," she murmured. "Then we won't rely on luck again," Dina replied, reigniting the engine. Ahead of them, the artillery positions came into view. 6 long-barreled guns dug into fortified earthworks, surrounded by trenches, ammo carts, and dozens of German soldiers working frantically under dim lamps. As Dina approached, Irina counted their options. Only 2 bombs remained. "We need to hit the center gun," Irina said. "If we break their middle line, the flank guns can't rotate fast enough to cover each other." Dina angled the plane upward, preparing to glide. But just as she cut the engine, a burst of machine gun fire tore through the tail. The Per-2 lurched violently. Dina fought to keep the glide steady as the airframe shuddered. Irina gripped the side rail, shouting coordinates through the chaos. Dina aligned the nose. Irina released the bombs. They fell in perfect silence. The first explosion obliterated the central artillery gun, sending debris into the trenches. The second blew apart an ammunition cart, igniting a chain reaction that engulfed the entire battery in fire and panic. German soldiers ran in all directions as flames spread through the earthworks, their shouts rising through the smoke-filled air. But victory came at a cost. The damaged Per-2 struggled to maintain altitude. Dina pulled the stick back as hard as she could, but the plane responded sluggishly. "We're losing lift," Irina said, her voice tight with fear. Below them, tracer fire erupted from the surviving German positions. A bullet grazed the left wing, tearing away more canvas. Dina pushed the engine to maximum, praying the old craft would hold together long enough to clear enemy territory. As they limped toward Soviet lines, the fog returned like a lifeline, swallowing the plane once more. Behind them, flames from the destroyed artillery battery lit the sky, shaking the horizon with dull, rhythmic detonations as stored shells cooked off. Dina felt the plane sinking, the wounded wing dragging them downward. "Come on, girl," she whispered to the aircraft. "Just a little farther." Irina spotted a clearing ahead, a narrow stretch of flat ground between clusters of trees. "There!" she shouted. Dina angled the plane toward it, cutting the engine and bracing for impact. The Power-2 hit the ground hard, skidding across the dirt, bouncing violently before sliding to a stop against a patch of tall grass. For several seconds neither woman moved, listening only to the ticking of the cooling engine. Then Irina laughed weakly. "We're alive." Dina leaned back, breath shaking. For now. They crawled out of the wreckage, bruised but intact. Within minutes, a Soviet patrol found them and helped escort them back to their regiment's field headquarters. As medics checked their injuries, their commander approached, eyes wide with relief. "You took out the entire center battery," she said. "The infantry reports the shelling has stopped. Your strike opened a hole in the line." Dina glanced toward Irina, who gave a tired nod. The mission had succeeded. At the edge of collapse, they had still delivered victory. As dawn broke, casting pale light across the shattered landscape, Dina sat beside the wrecked P-2, her hand resting on its damaged wing. It had carried them through hell and back. But the war wasn't finished. Stalingrad still raged. German forces still pushed. And tonight, the witches would rise again, not because they weren't afraid, but because the motherland demanded it. November 22, 1942, 3:03 a.m., beneath a sky frozen into a sheet of hard black glass above the steppe east of Stalingrad, Yevdokia Dina Nikulina sat on a small wooden crate near the runway, warming her numb hands over a tin cup of bitter tea as a faint orange glow pulsed from distant explosions along the encircled German lines, each tremor shaking the icy ground beneath her boots. The Soviet counter-offensive, Operation Uranus, had begun only days earlier, and already the Red Army had slammed, shut its iron ring around the Sixth Army, trapping nearly 300,000 German soldiers inside a tightening noose of frost, hunger, and despair. The night witches had been flying non-stop since the encirclement began, striking supply sheds, fuel dumps, makeshift airstrips, and any pocket of resistance that threatened to break the Soviet lines, and their regiment had become as much a psychological weapon as a physical one. German prisoners spoke of the terror that seized them whenever they heard a faint wind whisper through the night, unsure whether it was simply the breeze or the silent glide of a P-2 descending toward them like a curse, whispered by the darkness itself. Dina lifted the cup to her lips, the rising steam briefly fogging her vision, and for a moment she allowed herself a breath of stillness, one heartbeat of peace, before the night called on her again. Irina Molisheva sat beside her, wrapping a scarf across her face to block the sting of the cold, her eyes sunken from endless nights of flying, but still lit by that same fierce determination that no exhaustion could extinguish. "Command says we fly again in 30 minutes, Irina murmured, her voice muffled. 2 more strikes before dawn." Dina nodded without speaking. Words were unnecessary now. Their bond had become instinctive, built from shared terror, shared victories, shared refusals to die. As the regiment prepared for the next mission, mechanics dragged yet another patched-up P-2 from a sheltered alcove beside the field, its wings stiff with frost and its fuselage riddled with scars from the last 4 months of relentless operations. Dina approached it slowly, running her gloved hand along the wooden frame, feeling the rough patches, the uneven repairs, the history etched into every inch. These planes were fragile, obsolete by any rational wartime standard, yet in their fragility lay their power. Their slow speed made fighters overshoot, their light frames kept them aloft when heavy bombers would stall, and their engines were so quiet at idle that even trained German observers struggled to detect them until it was far too late. "Target is Pitomnik Airfield," Irina said, pulling a map from her jacket. "We're hitting the runways. Command wants to make resupply impossible. If the Germans can't land transport planes, the encirclement tightens." Dina studied the map. Pitomnik was heavily fortified, bristling with anti-aircraft guns, machine gun nests, and emergency lighting grids. The risk was enormous. But the payoff, strangling the Sixth Army's last hope, was greater still. She folded the map carefully, tucked it beneath her coat, and climbed into the cockpit. They took off at 3:41 a.m., frost trailing from their wings like streams of silver dust as the P-2 rose into the brittle night air. Beneath them, the frozen earth shimmered with scattered fires, remnants of the German attempt to break the encirclement. As Dina guided the plane westward, Irina scanned the ground with binoculars, noting troop movements, flashes of artillery, and faint glows of field hospitals. The steppe was a bleak, colorless expanse, silent except for the distant thunder of the collapsing front. The P-2 engine hummed softly, a lullaby of defiance against the vast emptiness below. "Almost there," Irina said after 20 minutes. "Searchlights ahead." Dina tightened her grip on the controls. She could already see the faint, unnatural gleam of German spotlights sweeping the sky in slow, disciplined arcs, beams of white slicing through the night like the blades of giants searching for prey. Dina killed the engine. Silence swallowed them instantly. The P-2 became a drifting shadow, gliding through the cold air with the grace of a falling leaf. The searchlights passed beneath them, unaware. Irina signaled their bearing. 50 meters lower, then straight ahead. Dina adjusted with delicate movements, feeling the air's resistance through her fingertips, the way a violinist feels a vibrating string. As they neared the airfield, they could see transport planes parked in rows, their silhouettes stark against the floodlights, Ju-52s meant to ferry supplies. Into the pocket and wounded men out. Dina breathed deeply, leveling the plane for the glide. Irina armed the bombs. "For Stalingrad," she whispered. Dina nodded, steadying the descent. Then the sky erupted. A burst of anti-aircraft fire exploded directly beneath them, shaking the P-2 so violently Dina nearly lost control. The searchlights snapped upward, converging in a blinding cage of white. "We've been seen," Irina shouted. Dina reignited the engine, banking sharply to the left as flak shells burst around them, sending shards of glowing metal ripping past their wings. A tracer round grazed the fuselage, showering sparks. Another shell detonated close enough to rattle their bones. Dina forced the plane into a spiraling dive, the world spinning around them in a blur of darkness and light. The searchlights followed relentlessly, their beams locking onto the fragile aircraft with predatory precision. Irina clung to the side rail. "We can't drop like this. Straighten her out." Dina gritted her teeth, leveled the plane, and aimed directly toward the brightest cluster of lights. The Germans thought she was suicidal, and maybe she was. She cut the engine again. The P-2 fell into a silent swoop. The searchlights passed overhead, overshooting their target. Dina held her breath, holding the glide steady as Irina leaned out, pulling the bomb release lever with both hands. The bombs tumbled through the dark and landed in the center of the runway. The explosion tore through the concrete, sending debris into two parked transport planes and lighting the entire airfield in a wave of sudden fire. Germans scrambled wildly, shouting, running, firing blindly into the night. A second explosion followed as fuel tanks ignited. The airfield glowed like a burning wound in the frozen earth. Dina restarted the engine, but it sputtered, coughing violently. A shell fragment had pierced the side. Irina's eyes widened. "We're losing pressure." Dina pulled the throttle fully, willing the engine to hold. It groaned, rattled, then caught. Weakly, unevenly, but enough. She pulled the plane upward, weaving through sporadic flak bursts, climbing higher and higher until the fires below became distant, trembling lights on the horizon. They flew home in silence. Not the tactical silence of a glide, but the exhausted silence of survivors who had nothing left to say. When they landed, medics rushed toward them. Irina's jacket soaked from a small cut she hadn't noticed, Dina's left arm numb from a near miss. Commanders gathered, listening as Irina detailed the destruction of Pitomnik's runway. A Soviet officer turned to his aide. "No flights will land there for days," he whispered. "The Germans will starve." 2 weeks later, news reached the regiment. The Sixth Army had begun to collapse. Soldiers were freezing, starving, surrendering in staggering numbers. The ring around Stalingrad tightened until it became a fist. And in that fist, Germany's once unstoppable war machine shattered. On January 31, 1943, Field Marshal Paulus surrendered. On February 2, the last pockets of resistance died out. Stalingrad was saved. The war was far from won, but a new tide had begun. As spring approached, Dina stood beside a new platoon, her third replacement plane since the war began, watching the sunrise creep over the horizon. The frost melted beneath the first light, turning the field into a shimmering sea of silver droplets. Irina joined her, arms crossed, breath misting in the cold. "Do you think they'll still fear us?" she asked softly. Dina smiled, a tired, knowing smile. "They already do," she said, "because we are not done." And as the sun rose over a land scarred by war yet unbroken, the legend of the Night Witches, these young women in wooden planes who defied an empire, took root in history, whispered first by German soldiers in terror, then shouted by the world in awe. The witches of the night had become eternal. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered, and we would love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you are watching from. Our community spans from Texas to Tasmania, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You are part of something special here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for keeping these stories alive.